In 2010, a man who had spent 20 years counting dead beetles published a letter in Nature magazine predicting that American society would tear itself apart by 2020. In 2001, a woman died of bacterial meningitis in a New Hampshire hospital, 19 years before a KPMG auditor in Los Angeles would prove that her most ridiculed work was right all along. And in a kiln in the ruins of an ancient city, archaeologists found a letter that was never sent, written by a king who could see exactly what was about to destroy him and could not do a single thing to stop it. Those three stories are the same story. They are connected by a mechanism that has been confirmed across 5,000 years of recorded history, verified by 5 independent mathematical frameworks from 5 separate disciplines, none of which were building on each other's work. And the conclusion they converge on is something that should be front-page news in every country on Earth, but is not. Because the conclusion is this: the most dangerous phase of any society, the phase where collapse becomes mathematically inevitable, looks exactly like prosperity. Not before prosperity, not after it. The prosperity itself is the mechanism, and every metric you have been taught to read as evidence that the system is working is, according to the math, evidence that it is already too late. Tonight we are going to follow that mechanism from a Bronze Age trade empire that vanished in 50 years, through the Roman denarius losing 90% of its silver, while the economy appeared to grow, to a NASA-funded model that showed civilization can collapse from inequality alone, with abundant resources, a model NASA then publicly disowned. We are going to meet the beetle ecologist whose prediction came true, and the dead woman whose model was mocked for half a century until a corporate analyst proved it right. And by the end, the question will not be whether this pattern is real. The evidence settled that. The question will be whether you are living inside it right now, and whether knowing changes anything at all. So settle in, get comfortable. If you are not subscribed, tonight is a good night to join. And if you want to go deeper into topics like this, across physics, history, collapse dynamics, and the mathematics underneath all of it, the Patreon is where the wider conversation lives. Stay to the end of this one, because the last 20 minutes land in a place that I genuinely did not expect when I started the research, and it has not left me alone since. Let's start where it started. The last letter ever written from the city of Ugarit was found in a kiln, still unbaked. It had not been fired yet. It had not been sent. It was addressed to the king of Alashia, modern-day Cyprus, and it was a plea. The king of Ugarit wrote that enemy ships had been spotted at sea, that his own army was deployed far away in Hittite territory, that his chariot forces were stationed in another region entirely. He wrote, and I want you to hear the exact phrasing: "Because it matters, my father, behold, the enemy's ships came here. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. Does not my father know that all my troops and chariots are in the land of Hatti, and all my ships are in the land of Lucca? Thus the country is abandoned to itself." That letter was never sent. It was found 3,000 years later, sitting in a kiln in the ruins of a city that had been burned to the ground. And here is the detail that should keep you up tonight. At the moment that letter was written, Ugarit was one of the wealthiest cities on the face of the earth. It sat at the crossroads of the most sophisticated international trade network that had ever existed. Its merchants traded in copper from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan, lapis lazuli from the Indus Valley, gold from Egypt, silver from Anatolia. Its scribes had invented one of the earliest alphabets. Its port handled more cargo than any other in the Eastern Mediterranean. If you had visited Ugarit in 1200 BCE, you would have seen prosperity, wealth, sophistication, a civilization at what any reasonable person would call its peak. Within 50 years, Ugarit was gone. Not weakened, not diminished, gone. And not just Ugarit, the Mycenaean Greeks, gone. The Hittite Empire, which had rivaled Egypt for centuries, gone. The Kassite dynasty of Babylon, gone. The palace economies of Crete, gone. Writing systems that had taken centuries to develop were lost. Trade networks that had spanned 3 continents collapsed into silence. The Eastern Mediterranean entered a dark age that lasted, in some regions, for nearly 400 years. Archaeologist Eric Klein at George Washington University spent years studying this event. His 2014 book, published by Princeton University Press, was titled 1177 BC, the year civilization collapsed, and in it, he made an argument that overturns the standard explanation you were probably given if you heard about this at all. The standard explanation is the Sea Peoples, mysterious raiders from somewhere in the Western Mediterranean who swept across the coastline and destroyed everything. Klein argued that the Sea Peoples were, at most, a trigger. The real cause was systemic. The very thing that made these civilizations so wealthy, their interconnection, their trade dependencies, their specialized economies, was the thing that made them fatally fragile. He wrote that it was their very interdependence that hastened their dramatic collapse. Christopher Monroe, at Cornell, whom Klein cited, went further. He noted that the wealthiest city-states in the Eastern Mediterranean were the hardest hit because they were the most attractive targets and the most exposed to network failure. The wealthiest, the most connected, the most advanced, the most prosperous. Every time, I need to tell you about a man who thinks the exact same thing is happening right now. And unlike the historians who study the Bronze Age through pottery shards and clay tablets, this man can show you the math. In February of 2010, a scientist at the University of Connecticut published a short letter in Nature, one of the most prestigious scientific journals on Earth. His name was Peter Turchin, and in that letter, he made a prediction so specific that it should have been career suicide. He wrote, and this is a direct quote, "The next decade is likely to be a period of growing instability in the United States and Western Europe." He cited stagnating real wages, a growing gap between rich and poor, an overproduction of young graduates with advanced degrees, exploding public debt. He wrote that these seemingly disparate social indicators are actually related to each other dynamically, and the forces he described were set to converge around 2020. This was 2010. Barack Obama was in his first term. The Tea Party was the most radical political movement in America. Nobody had heard of Brexit. Nobody had heard of the Capitol riot. Nobody had heard of the phrase elite overproduction outside of a handful of academic papers that almost nobody read. And a man who had spent the first 20 years of his career studying the population dynamics of beetles looked at a set of equations he had adapted from ecology, fed in 200 years of American economic data, and told Nature magazine that American society was about to tear itself apart. Nature published it, and then, essentially, everyone ignored it. I want you to hold that in your mind. A falsifiable prediction, published in the most respected scientific journal on the planet, with a specific date, based on a quantitative model made by a credentialed scientist at a major research university. And the response from mainstream economics, from political science, from the institutions that are supposed to pay attention to this kind of thing, was functionally silence. Then 2020 arrived. The question this script is going to try to answer is not whether collapse happens. History answers that definitively. The question is whether prosperity itself is the mechanism, whether the very things we point to as evidence that the system is working are in fact evidence that the system is already terminal, and if so, what the math says about where we are right now. I need to start with Peter Turchin, because his story is the key that unlocks all of this. And his story begins, of all places, with beetles. Peter Valentinovich Turchin was born in 1957 in Obninsk, Russia, a small city about 100 kilometers south of Moscow that had been built almost entirely to house workers at the Soviet Union's first nuclear power plant. His father, Valentin Turchin, was a physicist, a computer scientist, and a Soviet dissident. The elder Turchin had written a book called The Inertia of Fear, criticizing the Soviet system, and by the mid-1970s, the KGB had made his life in the Soviet Union untenable. Think about what that means for a 20-year-old. You are studying biology at Moscow State University, one of the most prestigious universities in the Soviet Union. You have your career ahead of you. Your friends are there. Your language is there. Your entire world is there. And then your father is expelled from the country, and you have to leave with him, not because of anything you did, but because of who your father was and what he believed. In 1977, the Turchin family landed in New York. Peter was 20. He did not speak fluent English. He had to start over. He transferred to NYU, graduated cum laude with a degree in biology in 1980, and then went to Duke University for his doctorate. His PhD thesis, completed in 1985, was about the movement patterns of Mexican bean beetles, Epilachna varavestis. He was, by training and by profession, a population ecologist. For the next 2 decades, he studied how populations of animals, beetles and butterflies, and mice and deer, grow and crash. He published in ecology journals. He won grants. He built mathematical models of population dynamics. He was elected a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He was, by any reasonable measure, a successful conventional scientist, working in a respectable conventional field. I am telling you this not because it is interesting background, but because it connects directly to what Turchin did next. Because the mathematical tools he used to model beetle populations, differential equations, time series analysis, nonlinear dynamics, turned out to be the same tools you need to model something much larger and much more disturbing. Around the year 2000, Turchin began to wonder whether the population cycles he had spent his career studying in animals had analogues in human history, not metaphorically, literally. Could you model a civilization the way you model a population of deer? Could the same mathematics that predicted boom and bust cycles in insect populations predict boom and bust cycles in empires? He later described this period on his Substack. He wrote that he had grown up in a country that no longer existed, the Soviet Union, and that watching a superpower disintegrate in real time had planted a question in his mind that his career in ecology had given him the tools to finally pursue. A man who experienced the collapse of one society firsthand became the man who built the mathematics of why societies collapse. What Turchin built, working over the course of nearly a decade and drawing on a database of historical information that eventually grew to cover 5,000 years of human civilization across hundreds of polities, was a framework he called Cliodynamics, named after Clio, the Greek muse of history. The name was deliberate. It was a provocation. He was claiming that history, the discipline that prides itself on narrative and interpretation, and the uniqueness of each historical moment, could be reduced to dynamics. to equations, to curves. The specific model he developed is called structural demographic theory, and it tracks three variables: popular immiseration, which is a technical term for the declining economic well-being of ordinary people; elite overproduction, which is an increase in the number of people competing for a fixed number of elite positions; and state weakness, which is the declining fiscal and institutional capacity of the government to manage conflict. Turchin's claim, published in detail in his 2003 book Historical Dynamics, his 2006 book War and Peace and War, his 2016 book Ages of Discord, and his 2023 book End Times, was that these three forces interact in predictable cycles. When all three reach critical thresholds simultaneously, the society enters a period of crisis every time, in every civilization he studied. And the mechanism that drives all three of those forces into the danger zone is prosperity. Here is how Turchin's wealth pump works, and I am going to walk through this carefully because it is the single most important mechanism in this entire script. A society begins with relatively low inequality. Economic growth benefits most of the population. Wages rise, the middle class expands, everything looks healthy. This is what economists call the integrative phase. Turchin found this phase in post-World War II America, in early Republican Rome, in Song Dynasty China, in the Abbasid Caliphate. The pie is growing, and most people are getting a bigger slice. But growth does not distribute itself evenly forever. At some point, and Turchin identified the late 1970s as the inflection point for the United States, the returns on growth begin to concentrate. The people who own the capital, the land, the businesses, the financial instruments, they capture a larger and larger share of the new wealth. Meanwhile, the labor market becomes saturated. There are more workers than there are well-paying jobs. Immigration increases the labor supply. Technology replaces certain kinds of work. Globalization moves production to lower-cost regions. The result is that real wages stagnate. Then they decline. And this is not a market failure. This is the market working exactly as designed. The same growth that built the middle class eventually hollows it out. The wealth pump activates not when the economy fails, but when the economy succeeds. Now here is where elite overproduction enters. As a society becomes wealthier, more families can afford to educate their children. More people get degrees. More people expect professional careers, managerial positions, political influence. But the number of positions at the top of a society does not scale with the population. There are only 100 Senate seats. There are only a certain number of corner offices. There are only so many tenure-track professorships. You end up with more credentialed, ambitious people than there are elite positions available. Turchin documented this with devastating specificity for the United States. In 1983, there were roughly 66,000 American households with a net worth of $10 million or more. By 2019, that number had grown to 693,000, a tenfold increase in 4 decades. Meanwhile, American law schools were producing roughly 25,000 more graduates per year than there were legal positions available. 25,000 surplus lawyers every single year, many of them carrying 6 figures of student debt, expecting a career that the system was not going to give them. And those frustrated aspirants do not just disappear. They become what Turchin calls counter-elites. They are educated, articulate, ambitious, connected, and angry. They channel popular discontent into political movements. They attack the legitimacy of existing institutions. They provide the organizational and intellectual infrastructure for insurgent politics. Not because they are ideologues, at least not initially, but because the system promised them something it could not deliver, and they are looking for someone to blame. I need to pause here because I think the sheer structural elegance of this model gets lost if you move too fast. Turchin is not saying that inequality causes instability. That is a truism. Everyone knows that. What Turchin is saying is something much more specific and much more disturbing. He is saying that prosperity causes inequality, which causes elite overproduction, which causes counter-elite mobilization, which causes state weakness, which causes instability. The causal chain begins with prosperity. It does not begin with failure. It does not begin with bad policy or bad leadership or external shocks. It begins with success. The wealth pump is powered by the very engine of economic growth that everyone celebrates. Then the third variable activates. As inequality rises and elites fragment into competing factions, the state itself weakens. Tax revenues stagnate, because the wealth concentrates in the hands of people who are very good at avoiding taxes and very skilled at purchasing political influence to keep it that way. Public debt explodes to cover the gap. Institutional trust collapses because the institutions are visibly captured by competing elite factions. The government becomes less and less capable of managing the conflicts that the wealth pump is generating. And at some point, all three variables cross their thresholds at once, and the society enters what Turchin calls a period of disintegrative crisis. From his crisis database of 5,000 years of polities, Turchin assembled the statistics on how these crises typically resolve. 40% of rulers were assassinated. 3/4 ended in revolutions or civil wars, or both. 1/5 had civil wars lasting for at least a century, and 60% of the polities simply ceased to exist. That sentence is going to take on a weight later in this script that it does not carry yet. Now, in that 2010 Nature letter, Turchin was specific. He wrote that quantitative historical analysis reveals that complex human societies are affected by recurrent and predictable waves of political instability. He pointed to a 50-year cycle in American history, the 1870s, which featured a financial crisis that caused a depression across North America and Europe. The 1920s, which ended in the Great Depression. The 1970s, which saw stagflation, Watergate, social upheaval, and the beginning of real wage stagnation. And he said the next peak would come around 2020. In August of 2020, with the country convulsed by a pandemic, racial justice protests, an economic shutdown, and the most contested election in modern American history, Turchin and his colleague Andrei Koroteyev published a retrospective assessment in the journal PLOS ONE. They compared the prediction against a decade of actual data from the cross-national time series data archive. Their finding was that anti-government demonstrations and riots in the US, UK, and major Western European countries had, quote, increased dramatically during the 2010 to 20 decade, directly tracking the model's predictions. Turchin later wrote on his own website that when Nature had asked him for his forecast in early 2010, frankly, the results for the USA scared me. He described submitting the prediction with trepidation, knowing how it would sound. A beetle ecologist telling Nature magazine that America was about to fall apart. But the math was what the math was. In a 2025 interview with Newsweek, Turchin said that nearly every one of those indicators has intensified since his 2010 prediction. He cited the continued stagnation of real wages, the impact of artificial intelligence on the professional class creating a new wave of elite overproduction, and increasingly unmanageable public finances. He noted that his model did not predict specific individuals. It predicted impersonal social forces. Trump was a symptom, not a cause. If Donald Trump hadn't risen to power, Turchin told an interviewer at the China Academy in February 2025, if, for example, he had been assassinated, these forces would still have manifested, maybe not at the same time, but perhaps 4 years later. And here is the part that the academic establishment still refuses to engage with. A man made a prediction. He published it in the most prestigious journal in science. He gave a date. He was right. And the mainstream response has been to either ignore it or attack it on grounds that have nothing to do with the data. Compact magazine called the framework conceptually vague. Reviewers in Advisor Perspectives challenge the notion of elite overproduction by citing the college wage premium, which misses Turchin's point entirely, because the college wage premium measures the average return on a degree, not the distribution of outcomes among degree holders. And it is the frustrated tale of that distribution that produces counter-elites. The pattern of institutional avoidance is not incidental to Turchin's theory. It is predicted by it. A system in the late stages of the disintegrative phase cannot process warnings about the disintegrative phase, because the institutions that would need to act on the warning are themselves products of the forces driving the crisis. But Turchin's wealth pump is only one piece of this. And to understand why the full picture is so much worse than any single model suggests, you need to see the other pieces. Because what makes this story genuinely disturbing is not that one scientist predicted collapse from prosperity. It is that 3 completely independent research groups, using completely different methods from completely different disciplines, arrived at the same conclusion. And none of them were building on each other's work when they began. The second piece comes from an anthropologist named Joseph Tainter, and his story starts 3 decades before Turchin's prediction. Joseph Tainter was not at Harvard or MIT or Stanford. He was at Utah State University in the Department of Environment and Society. Before that, he had been a project leader for cultural heritage research at the Rocky Mountain Forest and Range Experiment Station in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He was an archaeologist by training, a man who spent time in the field studying the physical remains of civilizations that no longer existed. And in 1988, Cambridge University Press published his book, The Collapse of Complex Societies, in which he proposed a theory so simple it is almost offensive, and so well supported it is almost impossible to dismiss. Tainter's starting observation was that there was no good general theory of collapse. Every historian had their favorite explanation for their favorite civilization. Rome fell because of barbarians, or lead pipes, or Christianity, or moral decay. The Maya collapsed because of drought, or warfare, or deforestation. The explanations were always specific to the case. Tainter wanted to know whether there was something deeper, something structural, that connected all of these cases. His answer was 4 axioms. 1. Human societies are problem-solving organizations. 2. Socio-political systems require energy for their maintenance. 3. Increased complexity carries with it increased costs per capita. And 4. Investment in complexity as a problem-solving strategy reaches a point of declining marginal returns. That 4th axiom is the one that matters. Here is what it means in practice. When a society encounters a problem, it solves that problem by adding complexity, a new law, a new bureaucracy, a new technology, a new institution, a new layer of administration. In the early stages, this works beautifully. The first irrigation system produces an enormous increase in food production relative to its cost. The first legal code dramatically reduces conflict relative to the effort of creating it. The first standing army deters threats with brutal efficiency per soldier. But societies solve their easiest problems first. This is not a choice. It is a mathematical inevitability. The problems with the highest ratio of benefit to cost get solved first, because they are the most obvious and the most rewarding. Each subsequent problem is harder, more marginal, more expensive to address. The 100th regulation yields less improvement than the 10th. The 1000th page of the tax code produces less clarity than the first. And here is the trap. The cost of maintaining all that accumulated complexity never goes away. It just keeps growing. You are not only paying for the new complexity you are adding, you are paying for every piece of complexity you have ever added, forever. Every bureaucracy needs to be staffed. Every law needs to be enforced. Every system needs to be maintained. The maintenance cost of existing complexity is a permanent growing tax on the society's energy budget. At some point, the marginal return on new complexity drops below the cost of adding it. And at some point after that, the total cost of maintaining existing complexity begins to consume the society's surplus. The society has no margin left. Any shock, any drought, any invasion, any financial crisis that would have been manageable at an earlier stage now becomes an existential threat. Not because the shock is unprecedented, but because the margin has been consumed by the complexity that was supposed to solve problems, and is now the biggest problem of all. And the period during which complexity is generating positive returns, the period when each new addition still pays for itself, when the economy is still growing, when problems are still being solved faster than they are being created, that period is the period that looks like prosperity. Tainter demonstrated this with the Roman Empire, and I want to walk through the Roman case in detail, because the parallels to the present are the kind of thing that, once you see them, you cannot unsee. The Roman Empire, at the death of the Emperor Trajan in 117 CE, controlled the largest territory it would ever hold. The Madison Project at the University of Groningen, which produces the most widely cited historical GDP estimates, puts Roman Italy's per capita GDP at roughly $1,400 in 2011 purchasing power parity. For the empire as a whole, the estimate is lower, roughly $600 to $700. But even that lower figure represents a level of economic output that Europe would not surpass for more than 1,000 years. Roman roads spanned 80,000 kilometers. Roman aqueducts delivered over 1 million cubic meters of fresh water per day to the city of Rome alone. The empire had a functioning postal system, a professional civil service, a sophisticated legal code, international trade routes that reached China, and architectural achievements that still stand 2 millennia later. Aelius Aristides, a Greek orator, delivered his famous Roman oration in the 140 CE. It is essentially a hymn to prosperity. He praised the universal peace, the open commerce, the meritocratic governance, the sheer civilizational achievement of Rome. If you read it without knowing what came next, you would think you were reading about a system that had solved the fundamental problems of human organization. It reads like a man describing a civilization at the absolute peak of its powers. And during precisely that period, the mechanism was already running. The denarius, Rome's primary silver coin, had contained roughly 95% pure silver under Augustus in the late 1st century BCE. By the time of Nero in the 60s CE, it had been debased to around 80% silver. Nero needed money for his building programs and for the reconstruction after the Great Fire of 64 CE. Under Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, the man who wrote the Meditations, the man still held up as the ideal of wise governance. It dropped further. He needed money for the Marcomannic Wars. Under Septimius Severus, around 200 CE, it fell to roughly 50%. By the time of Gallienus in the 260 CE, the denarius contained less than 5% silver. The coin that had been the backbone of the most sophisticated economy on earth had become, in the space of 2 centuries, a copper token with a silver wash. What Tainter would tell you is that the debasement was not corruption. It was not incompetence. It was complexity maintenance. The Roman state was paying for a military that had grown to meet frontier threats on multiple borders simultaneously. It was paying for a bureaucracy that had expanded to administer an increasingly complex economy spanning 3 continents. It was paying for the grain dole that fed the urban population of Rome. It was paying for road maintenance, aqueduct repair, border fortifications, diplomatic missions, and the salaries of a professional civil service that had grown with every generation. The cost of maintaining that accumulated complexity exceeded what the tax base could support. So the state debased the currency. It extracted value invisibly from every citizen holding coins. It was the society consuming its own reserves to maintain a level of complexity it could no longer afford through transparent taxation. The Antonine Plague struck in 65 CE, right at the peak. It killed somewhere between 5 and 10 million people across the empire. And the standard narrative treats the plague as the beginning of Rome's troubles. But Tainter would argue, and I think the evidence supports him, that the plague was the kind of shock that an earlier, less complex, less brittle Rome would have absorbed. The empire had survived plagues before. What made this one different was not the pathogen. It was the margin. The margin had been consumed by 2 centuries of escalating complexity. The plague was the trigger. The cause was the structural fragility that peak prosperity had created. I want to make one more thing about the Roman case explicit, because I think it speaks directly to where we are now. At no point during the debasement of the denarius did the Roman economy appear to collapse. Trade continued. Cities were built. Wealth was accumulated. If you measured Roman GDP, it would have shown growth through much of the debasement period. The visible experience was still one of prosperity. The mechanism was invisible precisely because the metrics of the time, just like GDP today, measured activity, not sustainability. They measured the flow, not the stock. They measured how much was happening, not how much margin was left. And by the time the margin was visibly gone, which is what the crisis of the 3rd century was, the window for intervention had already passed. That distinction is the crack in the foundation that everything else in this script falls through. Accounting prosperity versus structural prosperity. The numbers can look good while the system is dying, and the numbers looking good is what prevents anyone from diagnosing the disease. Now let me take you to the 3rd model, because this is the one where the mathematics become truly inescapable. In 2012, a mathematician named Safa Motoshere at the University of Maryland, working with Eugenia Calnet, a meteorologist, and Jorge Rivas, a political scientist, built a mathematical model of human civilization using 4-coupled differential equations. Just 4 equations. Elitse, commoners, nature, wealth. They called it HANDY, which stood for human and nature dynamics. It was inspired by the classic predator-prey equations from ecology, the Lotka-Volterra equations, which describe how predator and prey populations cycle in a pattern that has been observed in everything from lynx and hare to phytoplankton and zooplankton. Motoshere adapted those equations to model human societies where the predator-prey dynamic is between social classes rather than biological species. The model was funded by a NASA Goddard Space Flight Center grant, number NNX 12AD03A, and what it found should have made global headlines. HANDY identified 2 distinct collapse modes: Type N collapses are driven by nature depletion. The society overexploits its resources, production declines, population crashes. This is the mode of collapse that most people already know about. It is the standard environmental warning. It is what you think of when you hear the word sustainability. But Handy also identified Type L collapses, and this is the one that should disturb you. In a Type L collapse, the resources are still abundant. Nature is not depleted. There is enough to sustain everyone. But the wealth distribution has become so stratified that the commoner class is deprived of resources while the elite class continues to accumulate. In the model, and this is the critical detail, the elite accumulation continues all the way up to the point of collapse. The aggregate numbers look fine. Total wealth is increasing. If you ran the model equivalent of GDP, it would show growth. The top-level indicators would flash green right up until the moment the system tips over. The paper was published in 2014 in the journal Ecological Economics, volume 101, pages 90 through 102. The authors wrote, "Economic stratification or ecological strain can independently lead to collapse, in agreement with the historical record." That word independently is load-bearing. You do not need resource depletion. Inequality alone, in the presence of abundant resources, is mathematically sufficient to cause total civilizational collapse. When the paper leaked to the press in early 2014, the media ran with it hard. NASA-funded study predicts collapse of civilization. The coverage was dramatic, arguably sensationalized, but the underlying mathematics was sound and the paper was peer-reviewed. And NASA's response tells you everything you need to know about how institutions handle uncomfortable truths. On March 18, 2014, NASA issued a formal press release, number 14-082, that stated a soon-to-be-published research paper was not solicited, directed, or reviewed by NASA. They acknowledged the funding, they acknowledged the computing resources, but they wanted the world to know that the conclusions were not NASA's conclusions, that NASA had funded the work but did not endorse it. Think about that for a moment. A mathematical model built by credentialed scientists at a major university, funded by a NASA grant, using NASA computing resources, produced a result showing that civilization could collapse from inequality alone, even with abundant resources. And the agency that funded it publicly ran from the findings, not because anyone identified an error in the equations, not because the peer reviewers rejected it. The paper was published, the math stood, but the conclusion was, for the institutions of American science, unbearable. So they disowned it. I am going to connect these three frameworks now, because the convergence is where this story becomes something you cannot wave away by disputing any single model. Turchin's wealth pump says prosperity concentrates wealth, which overproduces elites, which destabilizes the state. That is a sociological model grounded in 5,000 years of historical data. Tainter's complexity trap says prosperity increases complexity, which faces diminishing returns, which erodes the energy margin until the society cannot absorb shocks. That is an archaeological model grounded in thermodynamic analysis. Motoshare's Handy model says stratification alone, even with abundant resources, can cause collapse because the elite insulates itself from the declining conditions of the commoner class until the system passes the point of no return. That is a mathematical model grounded in differential equations borrowed from ecology. Slightly disciplines, 3 methodologies, 3 completely independent research groups, and they all arrive at the same conclusion. Prosperity is the mechanism, the thing that looks like success is the thing that generates failure. And then there is Geoffrey West. West is a theoretical physicist at the Santa Fe Institute, and his contribution is in some ways the most unsettling of all, because it comes from physics, from the fundamental mathematics of how things scale. West spent years studying how biological organisms scale. When an animal doubles in size, its metabolic rate does not double. It increases by a factor of roughly 2 to the 3/4 power. This is called sublinear scaling, and it means larger organisms are more efficient. They burn less energy per unit of mass. This is why elephants live longer than mice. Biology scales in a way that favors efficiency and longevity as size increases. But when West turned his attention to cities and civilizations, he found something different. Socioeconomic quantities, things like GDP, patent production, wages, creative output, crime, disease, all scale superlinearly with population size at an exponent of roughly 1.15. A city twice the size of another produces not twice the economic output, but roughly 2.3 times the output. More wealth, more innovation, more of everything, including the negative things. This sounds like good news until you understand the mathematical consequence. Superlinear scaling implies a finite-time singularity. West described this in his 2017 book, Scale, and I want to give you his exact words because the precision matters. He said, "Our theory suggests we will face something mathematicians call a finite-time singularity, equations with superlinear behavior. Rather than leveling out like the sublinear ones in biology, go to infinity in a finite time. But that is impossible, because you are going to run out of finite resources. The equations tell us that when you reach this point, the system stagnates and collapses. The only way to avoid the singularity," West argued, "is through paradigm-shifting innovation. The steam engine, electrification, the internal combustion engine, computing. Each paradigm shift resets the clock, pushes the singularity further out, buys more time. But each successive innovation must come faster than the last. The intervals between paradigm shifts must shrink. Steam to electricity took roughly a century. Electricity to computing took roughly half a century. Each reset buys less time. And at some point, the innovations would need to come so frequently, literally faster than a society can absorb and implement them, that the requirement becomes physically impossible to meet. 4 models, 4 disciplines, the same answer. And now I need to tell you about the woman who saw all of this 50 years before any of them, and what the world did to her for saying it out loud. Donella Meadows was born on March 13, 1941, in Elgin, Illinois. She studied chemistry at Carleton College, earned her PhD in biophysics from Harvard in 1968, and joined a team at MIT working on a project for an international think tank called the Club of Rome. She was barely 30 years old, and the book that came out of that project changed the course of her life in ways that were mostly terrible. In 1972, Meadows and her co-authors, her husband Dennis Meadows, Jorgen Randers, and William Behrens III, published The Limits to Growth. It was based on a computer model called World 3 that simulated the interactions between 5 global variables: population, industrial output, food production, resource consumption, and pollution. The model was built using system dynamics, a methodology developed at MIT by J. Forrester, and it ran on the kind of mainframe computer that filled an entire room and had less processing power than the phone in your pocket. World 3 ran multiple scenarios. The standard run, the business-as-usual scenario, assumed that humanity would continue operating the way it had been operating, with no major policy changes and no extraordinary technological breakthroughs. And it produced a specific result. Industrial output per capita would peak sometime in the 2010s to 2020s. Food production per capita would peak shortly after. Global population would peak around 2030. And then all three would decline sharply in what the authors described as a rather sudden and uncontrollable decline in both population and industrial capacity. The book sold 9 million copies. It was translated into 28 languages. It became, for a time, one of the most widely discussed publications in the world. Newspaper headlines screamed, "Computer predicts world collapse," and "A computer looks ahead and shudders." And then the backlash began. Economists attacked it from every direction. Yale economist William Nordhaus published a critique in 1973, arguing that the model failed to account for market responses to scarcity. If a resource becomes scarce, prices rise, which incentivizes conservation and substitution. The model, Nordhaus claimed, was too pessimistic about human ingenuity. Other economists piled on. The word Malthusian was deployed like a weapon, as if invoking the name of Thomas Malthus, who had predicted that population growth would outstrip food production in 1798, could retroactively invalidate a computer model built 2 centuries later. For decades, the standard line in economics and in popular discourse was that the limits to growth had been debunked. It had predicted collapse by 2000, the critics said, and that had not happened. Therefore, the model was wrong. This criticism was repeated so often and so confidently that it became something close to established fact. The problem is that it was false. The model never predicted collapse by 2000. The standard run showed industrial output peaking in the 2010s and decline beginning after that. The critics had either not read the model or had misrepresented it. But the false version of the criticism became the accepted version. And for the remaining decades of her life, Donella Meadows lived with the knowledge that her most important work had been dismissed based on a misreading, and that no amount of correction could undo the reputational damage. She published Beyond the Limits in 1992. She published Limits to Growth, the 30-year update, in 2004. She taught environmental studies at Dartmouth College for 29 years. She wrote a syndicated column called The Global Citizen for 16 years. She was a MacArthur Fellow. She lived on an organic farm in Plainfield, New Hampshire, and she said something in an interview that I have not been able to get out of my head since I first read it. She said, "From my point of view, as a scientist, there was nothing more stupidly obvious than to say that the Earth is finite and growth cannot go on forever." On February 20th, 2001, Donella Meadows died of bacterial meningitis at Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center in Lebanon, New Hampshire. She was 59 years old. She did not live to see what happened 20 years later. In November of 2020, a paper was published in the Yale Journal of Industrial Ecology, Volume 25, Issue 3, pages 614 through 626. The author was Gaya Herrington. Herrington was not an environmental activist. She was not a tenured professor. She was the Director of Sustainability and Dynamic System Analysis at KPMG, one of the 4 largest professional services firms on Earth. Her office was at 550 South Hope Street in Los Angeles. She audited corporations for a living. What Gaya Herrington did was something that, as she later explained in interviews, she found astonishing that nobody else had done. She took the recalibrated World 3 model from the 2004 update of Limits to Growth. She identified 10 real-world variables with reliable empirical data from the United Nations, the World Bank, the Food and Agriculture Organization, NOAA, and the Global Footprint Network. And she compared 50 years of actual data against the model's 4 main scenarios. She later told Vice News, "Given the unappealing prospect of collapse, I was curious to see which scenarios were aligning most closely with empirical data today." After all, the book that featured this world model was a bestseller in the 70s, and by now we would have several decades of empirical data which would make a comparison meaningful. But to my surprise, I could not find recent attempts for this, so I decided to do it myself. A director at KPMG noticed that nobody had bothered to check whether the most controversial model in the history of environmental science was accurate. In 50 years, nobody had checked. Her finding was devastating. Of the 4 scenarios, the 2 that tracked closest to reality were BAO 2, a revised business-as-usual scenario, and CT, the comprehensive technology scenario. Both scenarios predict a halt in industrial, agricultural, and welfare output within roughly a decade of 2020, followed by steep decline. The BAU2 scenario shows a steep decline beginning around 2040. The stabilized world scenario, the only one that avoids decline entirely, the one where humanity gets its act together and implements comprehensive reforms, was the one that diverged the most from observed data. Herrington said, in the same Vice interview, economic and industrial growth will stop and then decline, which will hurt food production and standards of living. In terms of timing, the BAU2 scenario shows a steep decline to set in around 2040. A model published in 1972, ridiculed for 50 years, dismissed as naive alarmism by an entire generation of economists, was subjected to a rigorous empirical comparison by a corporate data analyst at KPMG. And the model was right. 50 years of data tracked its projections, and the scenarios closest to reality are the ones that end in collapse. Donella Meadows died in 2001. She never saw Herrington's paper. She never saw the vindication. She spent the last 3 decades of her life being told she was wrong by people who had not actually read her model. And the model turned out to be right. And nobody has apologized. As of this recording, there has been no formal retraction or acknowledgement from any major economic institution that the standard dismissal of limits to growth was based on a misrepresentation. I want to stop here and make explicit something that has been running underneath this entire script, because I think the pattern matters as much as the science. Turchin was a Russian immigrant who studied beetles. He published a prediction. It was right. The academic mainstream ignored it. Tainter was an anthropologist at Utah State, not an Ivy League institution. His framework was dismissed as deterministic. Motoshere was funded by NASA, and NASA publicly disowned the results. Meadows was a 30-year-old woman in 1972 who was told her work was naive Malthusianism for 50 years, and then a KPMG analyst proved her right after she was already dead. Every single one of these researchers produced work that challenged the same foundational assumption, the assumption that growth and prosperity are evidence of systemic health. Every single one of them was marginalized, ignored, or attacked, not because their methods were flawed, because their conclusions were uncomfortable. The mechanism of suppression was not conspiracy. It was exactly what Turchin's model describes: institutional inertia, professional incentives, the social enforcement of acceptable questions. You do not suppress uncomfortable research by burning papers. You suppress it by not citing it, by not teaching it, by treating it as outside the bounds of serious discourse, by not checking whether the model was right for 50 years, and that institutional avoidance is itself a symptom of the disease they diagnosed. A society in the late stages of complexity cannot process warnings about complexity, because processing the warning would require the kind of radical simplification that the accumulated complexity makes impossible. The system cannot diagnose itself, because the diagnostic tools are part of the system. Now let me show you, with current data, why I believe we are not approaching the danger zone, but are already inside it. As of the first quarter of 2024, according to the Federal Reserve's distributional financial accounts, the top 1% of American households held 30.5% of all national wealth. The top 0.1% held 13.9%. The bottom 50% held 2.5%. That number has been declining for decades. Let me make those numbers tangible. The top 1% of American households is roughly 1.3 million households. The bottom 50% is roughly 65 million households. Those 1.3 million households hold 12 times more wealth than the 65 million households at the bottom, combined. 12 times as many resources in 1/50th of the population. As of September 2025, according to an Institute for Policy Studies analysis of the Forbes Real-Time Billionaires list, 905 American billionaires held a combined $7.8 trillion. If you spread that across all 130 million American households, every household would receive $60,000 more than the median annual household income. According to Gabriel Zucman at UC Berkeley, the 19 wealthiest American households saw their share of total national wealth jump from 1.2% in 2023 to 1.8% in 2024. That is the largest single-year wealth increase ever recorded for that cohort. 19 families. 1 year. Meanwhile, dark money spending in federal elections hit $1.9 billion in the 2024 cycle. 100 billionaire families spent $2.6 billion on political contributions, 16.5% of total contributions, up from $18 million, or 0.6% in the year 2000. Turchin's wealth pump is not a theory about what might happen. It is a description of what is happening. The data is not ambiguous. And Tainter's EROI analysis tells the same story from the other side of the ledger. The energy return on investment for American oil production fell from approximately 1,000 to 1 in 1919 to roughly 5 to 1 in 2010. That data comes from a 2014 paper by Charles Hall, Jessica Lambert, and Stephen Ballow in Energy Policy, Volume 64. 5 to 1 is the threshold that multiple researchers, including Murphy in 2014 and King and Van den Berg in 2018, identify as the edge of the energy cliff, the point below which the net surplus energy available to power civilization drops exponentially. We are at or near that threshold right now. And the economy does not show this. GDP does not measure the energy cost of energy production. It measures the economic activity generated. And as EROI declines, more economic activity is required to extract less net energy. Drilling deeper, fracking tighter rock, building more complex refineries. All of that activity raises GDP. The accounting says growth. The thermodynamics say decline. And the gap between what the accounting says and what the physics says is the gap that civilizations fall through. Let me show you one more historical case, because the Ming dynasty illustrates the mechanism with a specificity that I find almost unbearable. Under the Wanli Emperor in the late 1500s, Ming China commanded an estimated 29% of global GDP according to Angus Madison's historical estimates. Think about that number. A single polity controlling nearly a third of all economic output on Earth. Silver flowed in from Spanish colonies in the Americas and from Japanese mines. The economy appeared to be booming. Cities were growing. Commerce was thriving. Trade was expanding. The economic historian Liang Fang-zhong, in a phrase that deserves to be far more widely known than it is, called it false prosperity. The silver monetization created the appearance of wealth without underlying productivity gains. The silver was not creating new capacity. It was lubricating exchange in ways that made the economy look bigger than it was in real terms. Tax revenues rose because taxes were now denominated in silver. But the tax burden fell disproportionately on the commoner class. The elite accumulated silver. The common farmers accumulated debt. The Gini coefficient, if anyone had been measuring it, would have shown exactly the curve that Turchin's wealth pump predicts. When Spanish and Japanese silver inflows collapsed in the 1630s due to disruptions in Spanish colonial supply chains and Japanese trade restrictions, deflation hit immediately. Farmers could not pay their taxes. The government could not pay its soldiers. Famines struck multiple provinces simultaneously. Rebellions erupted. And in 1644, the Chongzhen Emperor, the last ruler of the Ming dynasty, walked to a tree on Coal Hill, just north of the Forbidden City, and hanged himself. He was 33 years old. The dynasty that had commanded nearly a third of global economic output was finished within a decade of the silver collapse. The collapse was not caused by the silver disruption. The silver disruption was the trigger. The cause was the structural fragility that false prosperity had created and concealed for decades. The wealth pump had been running. The complexity had been building. The margin had been consumed. And none of it was visible in the numbers that mattered to the people making decisions, because the numbers measured the flow of silver, not the health of the system. I keep coming back to Liang Fang-zhong's phrase, false prosperity, not fake prosperity, not imagined prosperity. False prosperity. Prosperity that is real in the sense that real money is changing hands, and real buildings are being built, and real trade is happening. But false in the sense that the structural conditions underneath that visible prosperity are deteriorating, and the deterioration is invisible precisely because the prosperity is real enough to obscure it. And I think that is where we are now, not approaching the cliff, standing on it, looking out at a view that includes record stock market indices and record billionaire wealth and record GDP, and thinking, because the view is impressive, that we must be safe, while underneath our feet, the EROI is at 5-to-1 and declining. The wealth concentration exceeds any prior period in American history. The political stress indicator is at its highest recorded level, and a KPMG analyst has shown that 50 years of data track the scenario that ends in decline beginning around 2040. Every model says the same thing. Turchin's, Tainter's, Moteshare's, West's, Herrington's vindication of Meadows. 5 independent threads, 5 different methodologies, 5 different datasets, 5 different decades, and they all point to the same window. And the people who should be acting on this information are not acting on it. Not because they are stupid, not because they are corrupt, although some of them are, but because the structure of the system they inhabit makes it impossible for them to act on it. A politician who runs on, "We need to reverse the wealth pump and accept lower GDP," does not get elected. An economist who publishes "GDP is a misleading indicator of systemic health" does not get cited. A CEO who tells shareholders we should accept lower returns to reduce systemic fragility does not remain a CEO. The incentive structure of the system is optimized for the very behaviors that the models identify as the drivers of collapse. The system selects for its own destruction, and it calls the selection process success. That is the deepest implication. Not that collapse is coming. Collapse is always coming, eventually, for every complex society. That is what 5,000 years of data show. The deepest implication is that the mechanism cannot be disarmed from inside the system it built, because the people with the power to disarm it are the products of the mechanism. They were selected by it. They were elevated by it. They benefit from it. And the institutional structures that would need to implement reform are themselves the accumulated complexity that is consuming the margin. The letter from Ugarit was found in a kiln. It had been written. The king knew something was wrong. He described the threat with precision. His ships were elsewhere. His army was elsewhere. The country was abandoned to itself. He understood the situation clearly enough to describe it in writing, and he still could not save his city. Knowing what was happening was not enough, because the structural conditions that created the vulnerability, the very trade relationships and military commitments and specialized economy that had made Ugarit wealthy, were the same conditions that made response impossible. The army was in Hatti because Ugarit's prosperity depended on its alliance with the Hittites. The ships were in Lucca because Ugarit's trade required protection of distant sea routes. The wealth and the fragility were the same thing. Peter Turchin was born in a country that no longer exists. The Soviet Union collapsed 2 years after its oil production peaked. He watched it happen. He was 14 when his family was expelled. He spent his career trying to understand why it happened and whether the mathematical patterns that predicted it could be applied to other societies. He published his prediction in Nature. He gave a date. He was right, and the institutions that should be building on his work are still, as of this recording, treating Cliodynamics as a curiosity rather than as the warning system it was designed to be. Donella Meadows built a model in 1972 that predicted industrial output would peak in the 2010s. She was ridiculed for half a century. She died at 59 without seeing vindication. The vindication came anyway, published in a Yale journal by a KPMG analyst, and the world did not notice. Joseph Tainter wrote in 1988 that the dynamics of diminishing returns on complexity are operating in modern industrial societies. The energy return on investment for American oil has since fallen from 100 to 1 to 5 to 1. He was right, and his book is still treated as a niche academic curiosity, rather than as the diagnostic it actually is. Safa Motoshere showed that inequality alone, with abundant resources, is sufficient to cause collapse. NASA funded his work and then publicly disowned it. The math has never been refuted, and Gaya Herrington, a corporate analyst with no ideological axe to grind, showed that 50 years of empirical data track the limits to growth scenarios that end in decline. She said the window to change course was closing. That was 2021, 5 years ago. I do not know what happens next. Nobody does. The models do not predict specific events. They predict conditions under which specific events become overwhelmingly likely. The wealth pump does not tell you who leads the revolution. The complexity trap does not tell you which shock triggers the cascade. The handy equations do not tell you which year. The commoner class can no longer sustain the elite extraction rate. What they tell you is that the conditions are present. All of them, right now, at levels that match or exceed every historical case study in the database, and that every previous time these conditions were present, the outcome was the same. Not a gentle correction, not a soft landing, not a graceful transition to a new equilibrium, but a disintegrative crisis that ended 60% of the time with the society ceasing to exist. But I have not yet shown you the pattern that Turchin considers the most instructive parallel to the present United States. And that parallel is not Rome, and it is not the Bronze Age. It is France, specifically the century leading up to 1789. The French economy in the middle of the 18th century was, by the standards of its time, prosperous. France was the most populous country in Europe, with roughly 28 million people. It was the cultural capital of the Western world. Its aristocracy lived in a splendor that had no equal on the continent. Versailles alone employed over 1,000 servants. French wine, French fashion, French philosophy, French cuisine, all of these dominated European culture. If you had been an alien observing Earth from orbit in 1770 and you had to pick the civilization most likely to endure, you might well have picked France. Turchin, in his 2016 book, Ages of Discord, mapped the French case onto his structural demographic framework and found that every variable tracked the same trajectory he later identified in the United States. Real wages for French laborers peaked in the early 1700s and then declined steadily for the rest of the century. The price of bread, the staple food of the French commoner, rose much faster than wages. Between 1720 and 1789, the price of a 4-pound loaf of bread roughly doubled while nominal wages rose by barely a third. The purchasing power of the average French worker was in steady decline for 70 years before the Revolution. Meanwhile, the French elite was expanding. The number of noble families grew. The number of office holders grew. The sale of venal offices, a practice where the French crown sold government positions to raise revenue, created thousands of new quasi-nobles who had purchased their status rather than inheriting it. The result was exactly what Turchin's model predicts: too many people competing for too few elite positions, frustration among the educated class, lawyers, journalists, minor nobles, educated bourgeois, all of them credentialed, all of them ambitious, all of them locked out of the real levers of power by an aristocracy that had grown but not fast enough to absorb them all. And the state was fiscally exhausted. France had spent enormous sums on the 7 Years' War and on supporting the American Revolution. The national debt had ballooned. Tax revenues were inadequate because the nobility and the clergy, the two wealthiest estates, were largely exempt from direct taxation. The burden fell disproportionately on the commoner class, the third estate, which was already experiencing declining real wages. Popular immiseration, elite overproduction, state fiscal weakness, all three at once, the wealth pump running for 70 years, and the visible surface of French society, the one that foreign visitors admired, was still one of cultural brilliance and aristocratic opulence. The prosperity was real. It was just very unevenly distributed, and the structural fragility it concealed was invisible to anyone measuring prosperity by the wrong indicators. When the revolution came in 1789, it was not because the French people suddenly became ideological. It was because the structural conditions had reached the thresholds that Turchin's model identifies as the zone of crisis. The trigger was a fiscal emergency, the convening of the Estates General to address the national debt. But the cause was decades of wealth pumping that had concentrated resources at the top, while immiserating the bottom and overproducing frustrated elites who had the education and the ambition to lead a revolt. And here is the detail that connects directly to the present. The counter-elites of the French Revolution were not peasants. They were lawyers. Robespierre was a lawyer. Danton was a lawyer. Desmoulins was a lawyer and journalist. These were educated, credentialed men who had been promised a career by their education and denied that career by the structure of French society. They are the exact demographic that Turchin identifies as the most dangerous product of elite overproduction. Not the poor. The poor are too busy surviving to organize a revolution. It is the frustrated middle, the people who have enough education to articulate their grievances and enough social standing to be heard, who become the catalysts. Turchin has said in multiple interviews and in his books that the American 25,000 surplus lawyers per year are the modern equivalent of the revolutionary lawyers of 1789, not because they will literally storm the Bastille, but because they represent the same structural dynamic, an educated class with expectations the system cannot fulfill, carrying debt the system promised would be worth it, discovering that the promise was a lie, and looking for someone or something to blame. I want to come back to the Soviet Union now, because the Soviet case illustrates a different facet of the same pattern, the facet that connects most directly to Tainter's energy analysis. The Soviet Union in the early 1980s appeared stable, not prosperous by Western standards, but stable. The military was formidable. The space program was active. The bureaucracy functioned. The social safety net, such as it was, provided basic services. Oil revenues funded the entire apparatus. Soviet oil production reached 12.6 million barrels per day in 1988, making the USSR the largest oil producer on Earth. That revenue subsidized everything: the military, the industrial base, the social programs, the satellite states. The entire Soviet system was, in Tainter's terms, a complexity structure maintained by an energy subsidy. When oil production peaked in 1988 and began to decline, the entire edifice came apart in 3 years. By 1991, the Soviet Union had ceased to exist. By 1995, oil production had fallen to roughly 7 million barrels per day, a decline of nearly 50%. Douglas Reynolds at the University of Alaska Fairbanks argued that the decline in oil production was the proximate cause of Soviet collapse. Former Russian Prime Minister Yegor Gaya made the same argument in his 2007 book, noting that the collapse should serve as a lesson to those who construct policy based on the assumption that oil prices will remain perpetually high. What makes the Soviet case so relevant to Tainter's framework is the speed of it. The Soviet Union did not decline gradually over centuries like Rome. It went from apparent stability to complete dissolution in under 3 years, because the energy subsidy was not just supporting the system, it was the only thing supporting the system. The accumulated complexity of the Soviet state, the military, the bureaucracy, the industrial apparatus, the satellite empire, had grown to consume essentially all of the available energy surplus. There was no margin. When the energy supply declined, there was nothing to cut that would not cause a cascading failure in everything else. The military could not be reduced without losing the satellite states. The satellite states could not be lost without losing the buffer zone. The bureaucracy could not be reduced without losing administrative capacity. Every piece of the system depended on every other piece, and the whole thing depended on oil revenues. And when the oil revenues declined, it all went at once. Peak Soviet oil production was peak Soviet prosperity, in the narrow sense that the state had more revenue than at any prior point. And peak Soviet prosperity was the point of maximum fragility, the point at which the system had the least margin to absorb a shock, because the prosperity was not surplus. It was being consumed by complexity maintenance, in real time, as fast as it was generated. I think about this when I look at the American EROI numbers: 1,000 to 1 in 1919, 100 to 1 in 1950, 25 to 1 in 1970, 5 to 1 in 2010. The decline has been slower than the Soviet case because the American economy is more diversified and has more energy sources. But the trajectory is the same. The surplus that once powered expansion and innovation is now being consumed by the cost of extracting harder-to-reach energy. And the economy does not show this because GDP measures activity, not surplus. A society spending more and more effort to extract less and less net energy registers as economic growth. The hamster running faster on the wheel registers as increased activity. It does not register as the wheel getting harder to turn. There is one more layer to this, and it is the layer that I think makes the case genuinely airtight. Because you could, if you were determined, dismiss any one of these models. You could argue that Turchin's historical patterns are cherry-picked. You could argue that Tainter's complexity argument is too abstract. You could argue that Montechere's handy model is too simplified. You could argue that West's scaling laws do not apply to real economies. You could argue that Herrington's data comparison is not definitive. But you cannot dismiss all of them at once, not honestly, because they are not variations of the same argument. They are completely different arguments from completely different disciplines using completely different methods that converge on the same conclusion. The probability that 5 independent research programs would all arrive at the same wrong conclusion by coincidence is vanishingly small. The convergence is the evidence. Let me lay it out explicitly. Turchin works with historical data, centuries of records on wages, wealth distribution, elite demographics, and political violence. His method is statistical. His evidence is empirical. His prediction for 2020 was confirmed by observation. Tainter works with archaeological evidence and thermodynamic analysis. His method is comparative. His evidence is the material remains of collapsed civilizations plus modern energy data. His framework explains why Rome fell, why the Maya collapsed, and why modern EROI decline threatens current civilization. Montechery works with differential equations. His method is mathematical. His evidence is the behavior of the model under different parameter settings. Handy shows that inequality alone, without resource depletion, can cause collapse, and that the collapse is preceded by apparently healthy aggregate indicators. West works with scaling laws derived from physics. His method is theoretical. His evidence is the mathematical behavior of superlinear growth curves. His framework shows that the growth mechanism of civilizations contains a built-in singularity that requires ever faster innovation to postpone. Herrington works with empirical data comparison. Her method is statistical. Her evidence is 50 years of UN, World Bank, and FAO data, compared against the World 3 model. Her finding is that reality tracks the collapse scenarios more closely than the stability scenario. 5 different toolkits, 5 different evidence bases. One conclusion: prosperity is the mechanism of collapse, not the defense against it. I want to talk now about what it actually looks like. On the ground, in the present, when the wealth pump is running and the complexity is accumulating and the margin is being consumed. Because abstract frameworks mean nothing if they do not connect to the lived experience of the people inside the system. In the United States, in 2024, the average American household owed approximately $104,000 in debt, including mortgages, student loans, auto loans, and credit cards. Total U.S. household debt exceeded $17.7 trillion. Student loan debt alone stood at approximately $1.77 trillion, held by roughly 43 million borrowers, with an average balance of roughly $41,000 per borrower. American life expectancy peaked in 2014 at 78.9 years and has since declined, a reversal virtually unprecedented in a developed country during peacetime. By 2021, it had fallen to 76.4 years. The decline was driven in part by what economists Anne Case and Angus Deaton, both at Princeton, termed deaths of despair, deaths from drug overdose, alcohol-related liver disease, and suicide concentrated among middle-aged white Americans without a college degree. Case and Deaton published their initial findings in 2015 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and the data has only gotten worse since then. The opioid epidemic alone has killed more than 1 million Americans since 1999. The U.S. Code of Federal Regulations exceeded 180,000 pages as of 2020. The Federal Tax Code exceeds 75,000 pages. The average American small business owner spends an estimated 240 hours per year on federal tax compliance alone. These are direct measures of Tainter's accumulated complexity, the layers of rules and institutions that were each created to solve a specific problem, and that collectively consume an enormous share of societal energy to maintain. U.S. infrastructure received a grade of C- from the American Society of Civil Engineers in their most recent report card. Nearly 42% of all bridges in America are at least 50 years old. Over 46,000 bridges are classified as structurally deficient. The estimated cost to address the nation's infrastructure backlog exceeds $2 trillion. This is what it looks like when a society's maintenance costs begin to exceed its willingness to pay them. The complexity was built during the period of high-energy surplus. The maintenance costs persist long after the surplus has declined. And none of these indicators appear in the metrics that dominate public discourse. GDP does not measure life expectancy decline. GDP does not measure the debt burden on households. GDP does not measure the cost of regulatory compliance. GDP does not measure infrastructure decay. GDP measures economic activity, and economic activity can increase while all of those things are getting worse. In fact, economic activity often increases because those things are getting worse. Treating opioid addiction generates economic activity. Filing complex taxes generates economic activity. Repairing crumbling bridges generates economic activity. A society that is breaking down in slow motion can, and often does, register that breakdown as growth. This is what Liang Fangzhong meant by false prosperity in the Ming Dynasty. This is what Tainter means by the distinction between gross complexity and net benefit. This is what Motasheri's handy model shows when the aggregate wealth variable continues to climb even as the commoner welfare variable collapses. The numbers are real. The growth is real. And the system is dying. I said earlier that the mechanism cannot be disarmed from inside the system it built. I want to explain what I mean by that, because I think it is the most uncomfortable conclusion in this entire script, and I do not want to state it without showing you why I believe it. Consider what reform would look like. To reverse Turchin's wealth pump, you would need to dramatically redistribute wealth downward. You would need to sharply increase top marginal tax rates. You would need to restrict the ability of wealthy individuals and corporations to influence political outcomes. You would need to reduce the supply of elite aspirants by restructuring higher education. You would need to strengthen the fiscal capacity of the state. Turchin himself has said that all of this is theoretically possible. He points to the New Deal era as an example of a society that temporarily interrupted the cycle. But here is the structural problem. The people who would need to implement those reforms are, by definition, the people who have been selected by the current system. They are the products of elite overproduction. They have been elected using money from the same wealth concentration they would need to reverse. Their careers depend on the institutions whose complexity they would need to reduce, and the political system that would need to enact these changes is itself the product of the state weakness that is one of the three drivers of crisis. You are asking a weakened state, captured by competing elite factions, to implement reforms that would reduce the power of those same elite factions. The request is structurally incoherent, not because reform is conceptually impossible, but because the preconditions for reform are destroyed by the same process that creates the need for reform. Tainter makes the same argument from the complexity side. To reduce complexity, you would need to eliminate layers of regulation, downsize institutions, simplify systems. But each of those layers has a constituency. Each regulation has a bureaucracy that enforces it. Each institution has employees whose livelihoods depend on it. Each layer of complexity creates its own political defenders. Reducing complexity is not a technical problem. It is a political problem. And the political system is itself a product of the complexity that would need to be reduced. Montesquieu's handy model is the bleakest on this point. In the model, the elite continues to accumulate wealth all the way through the collapse. They do not experience the declining conditions of the commoner class until it is too late, because their wealth insulates them. They have no incentive to reform, because, from their vantage point, the system is still working fine. Their food is not more expensive, their healthcare has not declined. Their neighborhoods are not deteriorating. They live in a bubble of continued prosperity, while the structural foundation underneath the entire system erodes. And by the time the erosion reaches them, the system has already passed the point where intervention would have helped. That is the trap. Prosperity conceals fragility. The people best positioned to see the data are the least motivated to act on it. The people most affected by the deterioration are the least positioned to influence policy. And the institutions that should be translating warnings into action are themselves compromised by the very dynamics being warned about. I do not know how to resolve this. I genuinely do not. Turchin offers some hope. He points to periods in history where reform happened, where the cycle was interrupted, where conscious policy choices compressed inequality and restored state capacity. The New Deal, the post-war European Social Compact, the early Roman Republic's debt forgiveness practices. These examples exist. Reform is not impossible in principle. But Turchin also notes, with the cold precision of a man who has counted the outcomes across 5,000 years, that reform is the exception. Collapse is the norm. Most of the time, the wealth pump runs until it breaks the system. And breaking the system looks like the statistics from his crisis database that I mentioned earlier. 60% of polities that enter the disintegrative phase cease to exist. I want to come back now to where this script began, because I think the letter from Ugarit is not just a historical curiosity. I think it is a diagnostic. The king of Ugarit knew something was wrong. He described the threat with precision. He knew his army was deployed abroad. He knew his navy was elsewhere. He knew his city was exposed. He articulated the problem clearly enough to write a letter about it. He was not ignorant. He was not in denial. He was a man who understood the situation and was structurally incapable of responding to it. His army was in Hatti because Ugarit's alliance with the Hittites was a key component of its security architecture. Moving the army home would have violated treaty obligations and collapsed the alliance system that had kept Ugarit safe for decades. His ships were in Lucca because Ugarit's trade routes required protection in distant waters, and pulling the ships back would have disrupted the trade that funded the army that was in Hatti. Every piece of Ugarit's prosperity was connected to every other piece, and you could not pull one thread without unraveling the whole fabric. The interconnection that created the wealth also created the paralysis. That letter was in a kiln because someone was in the process of firing it when the city burned. The administrative apparatus was still functioning. The scribes were still writing. The potters were still working. The systems of governance that had built Ugarit's wealth were still operating, producing paperwork, maintaining records, performing the administrative functions of a sophisticated state, right up until the moment the city was destroyed. The complexity did not shut down before the collapse. It ran until the fire consumed it. And I think about the 905 American billionaires with their $7.8 trillion, and I think about the 43 million Americans with their $1.77 trillion in student debt. And I think about the 25,000 surplus lawyers produced every year, and I think about the 180,000 pages of the Code of Federal Regulations, and I think about an EROI that has fallen from 1,000 to 1 to 5 to 1 in a century. And I think about a model published in 1972 that predicted industrial output would peak in the 2010s, and a KPMG analyst who showed in 2021 that the model was right and a world that did not notice. And I think about Peter Turchin, who was born in a country that no longer exists, who spent 20 years counting dead beetles, who looked at the equations and saw what was coming, who published it in Nature, who gave a date, who was right, who told Newsweek in 2025 that nearly every indicator has intensified, who wrote in End Times that the historical resolution of these crises typically involves eliminating the surplus elites through massacre, imprisonment, emigration, or forced downward social mobility. The models do not tell you when. They do not tell you how. They do not tell you who will lead or who will suffer, or what the other side will look like. They tell you that the conditions are present. They tell you that every previous time these conditions were present, the outcome was catastrophic. And they tell you that the transition from apparent prosperity to visible crisis has historically been very fast, much faster than anyone inside the system expected. Rome went from the apparent stability of the Severan dynasty to the crisis of the 3rd century in under 50 years. The Bronze Age civilizations went from peak trade to total collapse in roughly 50 years. The Ming dynasty went from commanding 29% of global GDP to dynastic extinction in under 2 decades, once the silver dried up. The Soviet Union went from superpower stability to dissolution in 3 years. And in every case, the people living through the prosperous phase believed they were safe. The Antonine Romans believed they were safe. The Bronze Age traders believed they were safe. The Ming merchants believed they were safe. The Soviet bureaucrats believed they were safe. They looked at their GDP equivalents and their trade volumes and their military strength and their cultural achievements, and they concluded that the system was working. The system was working right up until it was not. And the transition between those two states was, in every case, far faster and far more total than the preceding period of prosperity had led anyone to believe was possible. I started this script with a letter that was never sent. I want to end it with a question that I cannot answer. The king of Ugarit could see the ships on the horizon. He could count his missing soldiers. He could describe the structural problem, the army in Hatti, the navy in Lucca, the country abandoned to itself. He had the information. What he did not have was the ability to act on it, because acting on it would have required dismantling the very system that had made his city worth saving. We have the information. We have Turchin's prediction, confirmed. We have Tainter's framework, supported by 40 years of EROI decline. We have Motor-Cheret's equations, peer-reviewed and never refuted. We have West's scaling laws, mathematically rigorous. We have Herrington's data comparison, published at Yale, showing that reality tracks the collapse scenarios. We have all of it. The question is whether we are the king of Ugarit, writing a letter we will never send, understanding the problem we cannot solve, because the solution would require us to become something other than what the prosperity made us. The wealth pump cannot be stopped by the people it enriches. The complexity cannot be reduced by the institutions it built. The margin cannot be restored by the system that consumed it. And that brings me to the details I have been saving, because understanding the mechanism abstractly is one thing. Seeing what it looks like in the current American data is something else entirely. The visceral version is what will stay with you. In 1965, the CEO of a major American corporation earned roughly 20 times what the average worker in that corporation earned. 20 to 1. That ratio had been relatively stable since the post-war period. It was the product of the New Deal reforms that Turchin cites as a successful temporary interruption of the wealth pump. Progressive taxation with a top marginal rate that reached 91% under Eisenhower. Strong unions that bargained for real wage increases. The GI Bill, which expanded the middle class by making higher education accessible. Social Security and Medicare, which provided a floor beneath which people could not fall. These programs compressed the income distribution. They did not eliminate inequality. They managed it. Then, the late 1970s happened. The Powell Memorandum in 1971, written by future Supreme Court Justice Lewis Powell, laid out a blueprint for corporate America to reassert its political influence. The Reagan Revolution in 1981 brought deregulation, tax cuts that disproportionately benefited the wealthy, the breaking of the Air Traffic Controllers Union, and a philosophical shift that treated government itself as the problem rather than the mechanism of correction. The top marginal income tax rate dropped from 70% in 1980 to 28% by 1988. By 2024, CEO pay at major American corporations averaged roughly 350 times the median worker's pay. The ratio went from 20 to 1 to 350 to 1 in 60 years. That is not a fluctuation. That is a structural transformation. And the numbers underneath that headline ratio are, if anything, more alarming. Between 1979 and 2019, the hourly compensation of the top 1% of earners grew by 160.3%. The compensation of the bottom 90% grew by 26%. Over 40 years. Adjusted for inflation, the median male worker in the United States earned less in real terms in 2020 than he did in 1973. That is half a century of real wage stagnation for the median worker during a period when GDP roughly tripled. Corporate profits reached record highs and the stock market went from around 800 on the Dow Jones to nearly 40,000. The pie got dramatically bigger. The median worker's slice did not. That is the wealth pump, measured, documented, and undeniable. And the elite overproduction numbers are equally stark. In 1970, roughly 11% of American adults had a bachelor's degree or higher. By 2024, that number had risen to approximately 38%. The number of Americans with graduate degrees more than quadrupled. And while the economy grew, it did not create professional positions at anywhere near the rate it created credentialed aspirants. The Bureau of Labor Statistics has consistently shown that roughly 40% of recent college graduates are underemployed, working in jobs that do not require a college degree. Turchin's 25,000 surplus lawyers per year are one slice of a much larger phenomenon. Every year, the American education system produces hundreds of thousands of people who were promised that their degree would be a ticket to the professional class, and who discover that the professional class is full. The debt these people carry is not incidental to the mechanism. It is part of it. The average student loan borrower in 2024 owed roughly $41,000. The average law school graduate owed over $130,000. The average medical school graduate owed over $200,000. These are not people who can afford to wait patiently for the system to correct itself. They are people who need their careers to start immediately and at a certain income level, because they are already deep in debt. When those careers do not materialize, or materialize at a level far below expectations, the frustration is not abstract. It is financial. It is existential. And it is precisely the kind of frustration that produces what Turchin calls counter-elites. I want to be clear about something here. I am not making a political argument. I am not saying the solution is more progressive taxation, or less progressive taxation, or more regulation, or less regulation. I am describing a mechanism that has been documented across 5,000 years of history and that is currently operating in the most powerful country on earth. The mechanism does not care about your politics. It does not care about your ideology. It cares about wage trends, wealth distribution, elite demographics, and state fiscal capacity. And all four of those variables are currently in the zone that Turchin's crisis database associates with disintegrative crisis. Now let me go back to Herrington's findings, because I moved through them quickly and there are details that deserve more attention. Herrington compared 10 empirical variables against the World 3 model: population, birth rate, death rate, industrial output per capita, food per capita, services per capita, non-renewable resources remaining, persistent pollution, human ecological footprint, and human welfare index. For each variable, she had data from the United Nations Population Division, the World Bank, the Food and Agriculture Organization, NOAA, and the Global Footprint Network. The methodology was straightforward. She normalized both the model outputs and the empirical data to make them comparable. And then she measured the divergence between reality and each scenario using root mean square deviation. The scenario with the smallest divergence was the closest fit. For the period up to roughly 2010, all four scenarios tracked the data fairly closely, because the scenarios do not diverge significantly until the 2020s. This is a crucial point. The model was not designed to be tested against the first 50 years. It was designed to project forward. And now, as we move through the 2020s, the scenarios are diverging. Herrington's finding was that BAU2 and CT tracked the data most closely as of 2019, the last year for which she had complete data. BAU2, the scenario she described as most relevant to the current trajectory, models a world where pollution, particularly greenhouse gas emissions, becomes the binding constraint. In BAU2, industrial output per capita peaks around 2020 to 2030 and then declines steeply. Food per capita follows. Population follows. The decline is not gradual. In the model, it takes roughly 2 decades from peak to trough. By 2060, in the BAU2 scenario, industrial output per capita has fallen to approximately half its peak value. The CT scenario, comprehensive technology, assumes much higher rates of technological innovation, pollution control, and resource efficiency than have historically been achieved. Even in that scenario, industrial output still eventually declines, though more gently and later. And Herrington noted that the assumptions underlying CT are, quote, highly optimistic, given historic figures. The model assumes levels of technological progress that have not been observed in the real world. The stabilized world scenario, the only one that avoids decline, requires policy interventions that Herrington described as comprehensive and immediate. It requires a deliberate limiting of economic growth, a massive reallocation of resources toward pollution abatement and resource conservation, and a restructuring of the global economy away from growth as the primary metric of success. None of those things are currently happening, and the gap between what SW requires and what the world is actually doing is the gap that Herrington described when she said the window to align with the stabilized scenario is closing. I keep thinking about the timing. Herrington published in late 2020. The window she described was already closing then. It is now 2026, 6 years later, and the divergence between reality and the stabilized world scenario has, by every available metric, increased. Global carbon emissions hit a record high in 2023. Global GDP continued to grow. Global inequality continued to widen. No major economy has implemented the kind of comprehensive growth-limiting policies that SW requires. The Limits to Growth team, the group led by Donella Meadows, wrote in their 1972 report, the most probable result will be a rather sudden and uncontrollable decline in both population and industrial capacity. They were writing about a scenario that would begin to manifest roughly 50 years in the future. It has now been 54 years, and a KPMG analyst has confirmed that the most probable scenarios are the ones that involve decline. I think about Donella Meadows on her farm in New Hampshire, writing her Global Citizen column, trying to explain to a world that did not want to hear it that growth on a finite planet has consequences. She said, "From my point of view as a scientist, there was nothing more stupidly obvious than to say that the Earth is finite and growth cannot go on forever." She was right. And the fact that it took 50 years and her death for that rightness to be confirmed tells you everything you need to know about how complex societies process uncomfortable information. They do not process it. They wait until it processes them. There is a concept in systems dynamics that Meadows herself wrote about extensively in her posthumously published book, Thinking in Systems, which came out in 2008, 7 years after her death. She called it system traps. One of the most relevant to this discussion is what she called the success to the successful trap. In this dynamic, the winners of a competitive process gain advantages that make them more likely to win the next round, which gives them more advantages, which makes them more likely to win the round after that. The dynamic is self-reinforcing. Without external intervention, it produces ever-increasing concentration of whatever is being competed for, whether that is wealth, power, political influence, or access to resources. The success to the successful trap is, in systems dynamics language, what Turchin calls the wealth pump. It is the same mechanism described in different terminology by a different discipline. And Meadows noted that the trap has a specific property that makes it particularly dangerous. It is invisible from inside the system. The winners perceive their accumulation as the natural result of superior performance. The losers perceive their decline as personal failure. Neither side sees the structural dynamic that is driving the divergence. The system produces a narrative, meritocracy, that explains and justifies the outcome in terms that prevent anyone from questioning the mechanism. That narrative is itself part of the trap, because as long as people believe that the wealth distribution reflects individual merit rather than structural dynamics, they will not support the reforms needed to interrupt the cycle. They will blame themselves for their declining purchasing power rather than identifying the wealth pump. They will celebrate the success of the billionaire class as evidence that the system works rather than recognizing it as evidence that the system is extracting value from the bottom and concentrating it at the top. The narrative of meritocracy is the anesthesia that prevents the patient from feeling the surgery. And this brings me to the very last piece of this puzzle, the piece that I have been circling around for the entire script and that I now need to state directly. There is a version of this story that ends with a call to action, a version that says, now that you understand the mechanism, you can help stop it. You can vote differently. You can support different policies. You can organize. You can act. I am not going to tell you that, not because I do not believe in action, but because I think that framing misrepresents the nature of the problem. Individual action within a system that is structurally incentivized to produce collapse is not the same as systemic reform. Voting within a political system that has been captured by the wealth pump is not the same as interrupting the wealth pump. Organizing within institutional structures that are themselves the accumulated complexity consuming the margin is not the same as reducing complexity. Turchin, when pressed on solutions, points to the integrative phases that have historically followed periods of crisis. After the civil wars come the reforms. After the collapse comes the rebuilding. The question is not whether the cycle will eventually turn. It always does. The question is what happens during the turning. And the historical record on that question is, as I described earlier, grim. Massacres, civil wars, and state dissolution are the norm, not the exception. I also want to be honest about the limits of what I have presented. These models are models. They are simplifications of reality. Turchin's PSI is a useful metric, but it is not a crystal ball. Tainter's diminishing returns curve is a powerful framework, but it does not specify the exact point at which collapse becomes inevitable. Motashare's handy model uses 4 equations to describe a system of 8 billion people, which is by definition a radical simplification. West's scaling laws describe tendencies, not deterministic fates, and Herrington's comparison covers 50 years of data against a model that projects a century, which means we are still in the period where divergence between scenarios is just beginning to be measurable. These models could be wrong. The convergence could be coincidental. The patterns could break. Some unforeseen innovation, some unprecedented political movement, some structural shift that none of these frameworks anticipated could alter the trajectory. But I have spent an unreasonable amount of time with this material, reading the original papers, checking the numbers, tracing the citations, and I cannot honestly tell you that I think these models are wrong. The evidence is too consistent. The convergence is too clean. The historical pattern is too well documented, and the current data is too precisely aligned with the predicted trajectories. What I can tell you is what the data says. And the data says that every indicator these models track is currently in the danger zone, not approaching it, in it. The wealth pump has been running for 50 years. The EROI has fallen by 2 orders of magnitude in a century. The elite overproduction is at historical highs. The political stress indicator is at its highest recorded level. 50 years of empirical data track the limits to growth scenarios that end in decline. And 3 independent mathematical frameworks from 3 independent disciplines agree that the mechanism driving all of this is the same mechanism that produced the prosperity that everyone points to as evidence that the system is fine. The most dangerous phase of any society looks exactly like this one. It looks like where we are standing right now. It looks like the moment before the letter goes into the kiln, when the scribes are still writing, and the potters are still working, and the ships are still sailing, and the wealth is still accumulating, and everything looks like it is working. And somewhere out at sea, there are ships on the horizon. But before I leave you there, I need to tell you one more thing about Peter Turchin, because there is a detail about his biography that I saved for last, and it connects the personal to the structural in a way that I think is worth sitting with. Turchin grew up watching his father fight a system. Valentin Turchin, Peter's father, was a physicist who became a dissident because he could see that the Soviet system was built on premises that were mathematically unsustainable. The Soviet economy was structured around central planning, which is another way of saying maximum complexity. Every production decision, every price, every allocation of resources was determined by a bureaucratic apparatus that grew more complex with every passing decade. The number of products that needed to be tracked, the number of prices that needed to be set, the number of supply chains that needed to be coordinated, all of it grew exponentially while the capacity of the planning apparatus grew linearly at best. Valentin Turchin saw this. He wrote about it. He argued that the system needed fundamental reform. And the system's response was to expel him. Not because he was wrong, because he was inconvenient, because the complexity of the Soviet state had reached the point where it could not process criticism of its own complexity. The bureaucracy that would have needed to implement his reforms was the same bureaucracy that was the problem. Peter Turchin was 20 years old when his family was expelled. He watched his father, a brilliant scientist, be ejected from the only country he had ever known, not for being wrong, but for being right in a way the system could not tolerate. And then Peter Turchin spent 20 years studying the mathematics of population boom and bust cycles in beetles and butterflies and deer. And then he looked at the same mathematics applied to human societies and saw the same curves his father had intuited about the Soviet Union. Except now, he could quantify them. He could put numbers on the intuition. He could make predictions. And when he published those predictions, the response from American academic institutions was structurally identical to the response from Soviet institutions to his father's criticism. Not expulsion. Obviously, nothing so dramatic, but the same fundamental dynamic, a system that cannot process criticism of its own foundational assumptions, not because the criticism is wrong, but because processing it would require the system to question the premises that justify its existence. I think about that. A father expelled from the Soviet Union for pointing out that the system was unsustainable. A son marginalized by the American Academy for pointing out that the system is unsustainable. 2 generations of the same family, 2 different countries, 2 different ideologies, and the same structural response to the same structural warning. The system cannot hear what you are saying, because hearing it would require the system to question itself. And complex systems do not question themselves. They add complexity. That is the only move they know how to make. Turchin's crisis database contains a variable he calls the state breakdown probability. It measures the likelihood, based on the configuration of structural demographic variables, that a state will experience a major crisis within a given time window. For the United States, as of the publication of End Times in 2023, that probability was at its highest level since the Civil War period, higher than the Gilded Age, higher than the Great Depression, higher than the Vietnam and Watergate era. The only American period with a comparable configuration of variables was the 1850s, the decade immediately preceding the Civil War. That does not mean a civil war is coming. Turchin has been careful to emphasize that. The model predicts conditions, not events. It predicts the pressure, not the earthquake. But it does mean that the structural conditions that historically precede state-level crises are present, now, at levels that match or exceed the most dangerous periods in American history. And I want to connect this back to something Tainter wrote in the final chapter of The Collapse of Complex Societies, because I think it frames the situation with a clarity that is rare in academic writing. Tainter wrote that the only thing that has historically prevented collapse from diminishing returns on complexity is a major new energy subsidy, the discovery of a new continent, a technological revolution that opens a new energy source, the exploitation of a previously untapped resource base. Each of these resets the diminishing returns curve by introducing a new source of surplus. The problem, Tainter noted in 1988, is that there are no more continents to discover. The fossil fuel revolution was the most recent major energy subsidy, and its returns are now in steep decline. Nuclear power, which could in principle provide a high EROI energy source, has been plagued by public opposition, regulatory complexity, and cost overruns that have prevented it from scaling. Renewable energy sources, while growing rapidly, currently have EROI values that are debated but generally estimated in the range of 5 to 20 to 1, depending on the technology, the location, and how you account for storage and intermittency. Some of those values are at or near the energy cliff. The implied hope in every optimistic scenario is that some new energy technology, fusion, advanced nuclear, some as yet unimagined breakthrough, will arrive in time to provide the surplus that the declining fossil fuel EROI is consuming. Geoffrey West's framework makes this hope explicit. The singularity can be postponed by paradigm-shifting innovation. The question is whether the innovation arrives in time. And in time is getting shorter with every cycle. I do not know whether that innovation will arrive. Nobody does. What I know is that the models do not assume it will, and the models have been right so far. There is one last historical detail that I want to leave you with, because I think it captures something essential about the nature of this problem. In the ruins of the Hittite capital of Hattusa, in modern-day Turkey, archaeologists found administrative tablets dating to the final decades of the Hittite Empire, the 1220s and 1210s BCE. The tablets record the ordinary business of governance, grain shipments, legal disputes, diplomatic correspondence, military deployments, land surveys, tax records, the bureaucratic machinery of a sophisticated state humming along, processing paperwork, managing complexity. The last tablets from Hattusa show no awareness of impending collapse. There is no tablet that says the empire is falling. There is no administrative memo that says we are in crisis. The tablets just stop. One day the scribes were writing. The next day, or the next year, or the next decade, they were not. The complexity ran until it could not run anymore. And then it stopped. And the silence that followed lasted for centuries. The scribes at Hattusa were doing their jobs. The potters at Ugarit were firing their kilns. The bureaucrats were filing their tablets. The administrators were administering. The system was working, performing all the functions of a functioning system, right up until the moment it was not functioning anymore. And the transition between those two states left no record, because there was no one left to record it. I think about our own systems, the algorithms processing transactions, the bureaucracies filing regulations, the universities granting degrees, the corporations reporting earnings, the economists measuring GDP, all of it humming along, all of it performing the functions of a functioning system, all of it generating the data that we interpret as evidence of health. And somewhere, in a kiln, in a cabinet, in a server farm, in a peer-reviewed journal that nobody reads, there is a letter that describes the situation with perfect clarity. The army is in Hatti. The ships are in Lucca. The EROI is at 5 to 1. The wealth pump has been running for 50 years. The PSI is at its highest recorded level. The empirical data tracks the collapse scenarios. The country is abandoned to itself. I need to add one thing. Because in all of this, in all the models and the data and the historical cases, there is a dimension I have not addressed directly. And it is the dimension that makes this personal rather than academic. It is the dimension that turns the data into something that will follow you out of this video and into your own life. You are inside the mechanism right now, not metaphorically, not abstractly. Right now, as you listen to this, you are a participant in the dynamics I have described. If you have a job, your wages are part of the data that Turchin tracks. If you have debt, your balance is part of the leverage that makes the system fragile. If you have a degree, you are one of the credentialed aspirants whose expectations the system may or may not fulfill. If you pay taxes, your payments are part of the revenue stream that is failing to keep pace with the complexity costs of the state. If you own stocks, your portfolio value is part of the aggregate wealth indicator. The Motor-Chare's handy model shows climbing right up to the edge of collapse. If you have noticed that things seem harder than they used to be, that the cost of housing and healthcare and education seems to outpace your income, that the political system seems unable to solve obvious problems, that institutions you once trusted seem to have lost their competence, you are not imagining it. You are experiencing, from inside, the signature of a system in the late stages of the process these models describe. And that experience, the feeling that something is wrong but you cannot quite name it, the feeling that prosperity is real and yet something fundamental is off, the feeling that the numbers say everything is fine, but the lived reality tells a different story. That feeling is itself diagnostic. It is what it feels like to live inside the gap between accounting prosperity and structural health. It is what a Roman citizen felt in the 180s, when the economy was growing and the denarius was being debased. It is what a Ming merchant felt in the 1620s, when silver was flowing and the tax burden was crushing the farmers. It is what a Soviet engineer felt in 1987, when the oil revenues were at their peak and everything seemed stable and the whole edifice was about to come apart in 3 years. I want to be careful here, because I do not want to manufacture alarm. I am not telling you the world ends tomorrow. I am not telling you to sell everything and build a bunker. What I am telling you is that the structural conditions described by 5 independent research frameworks are present, now, at levels consistent with historical periods that preceded major systemic crises, and that the visible prosperity that seems to contradict this assessment is, according to every one of those frameworks, not evidence against the assessment, but evidence for it. The prosperity is the mechanism. That is the finding. That is what the convergence shows. That is what 5,000 years of data, 4 mathematical models, and 50 years of empirical vindication all point to. And the reason I made this video is not because I think I can change the trajectory. I do not have that power, and frankly, neither do you, individually. The reason I made this video is because I believe you deserve to have the information. Because Peter Turchin published his prediction in Nature and it was ignored. Because Donella Meadows published her model and it was ridiculed. Because Motor-Chare published his equations and NASA disowned them. Because Joseph Tainter published his framework and it was filed away in the archaeology section of university libraries, where almost nobody outside the field would ever find it. Because Gaya Herrington published her data comparison in a Yale journal, and the world barely noticed. Every single one of those publications is available to anyone who looks. The data is public. The papers are published. The math can be checked. And the cumulative weight of what they say is something that should be part of public discourse and is not. It should be discussed on the news. It should be taught in economics departments. It should be part of the conversation when politicians talk about growth and prosperity and economic success. It is not part of that conversation. And the reason it is not part of that conversation is itself part of the pattern. The system selects for voices that affirm its premises and marginalizes voices that question them. That is not conspiracy. It is the emergent behavior of a complex system that has been optimized for growth and cannot process information that challenges the assumption that growth is always good. I started this script with a letter that was never sent. I have given you the data that was in that letter. What you do with it is beyond the scope of what any model can predict. The models describe the pressure. They do not describe the response. And the response, if there is one, will not come from the system that created the pressure. It will come from people who understood the mechanism well enough to step outside of it. Whether that is possible, and whether it is possible in time, is a question I genuinely cannot answer. But the data is clear, and it has been sitting in plain sight for decades. And the fact that you are only hearing about it now in a video on YouTube, rather than from the institutions that are paid to understand and communicate these dynamics, should tell you everything you need to know about where we are in the cycle. The wealth pump is running. The complexity costs are mounting. The EROI is declining. The elites are overproducing. The margin is gone. The data tracks the collapse scenarios. The window is closing. And the letter is in the kiln.